Milkweed, Chapter 18. Winter. Yuri had found us by our first morning inside the wall, but now we saw even less of him. "Do you go to the other side?" I asked him. "Do you have a work permit?" "Don't ask questions." One cold day, Yuri and I were on the street, and I was wearing two coats, but I could not make my feet warm. There were many people. I saw a boy. At least I thought it was a boy. From his size, anyway. He was lying on the sidewalk, and I wondered how could he sleep with all the noise and the people. It was very strange because he was not in a doorway, where I had often seen people sleeping. He was not even on the edge of the sidewalk. He was lying right in the middle. The people just walked around him, making the shape of an eye. It was also strange that although nobody seemed to see him, nobody tripped over him. But the strangest thing of all was the newspaper. It covered him like a blanket. "Yuri," I said, "that boy's stupid. The newspaper can't keep him warm." "Nothing can keep him warm, Misha," said Yuri. "That boy is dead." We were stopped, looking down at the dead boy. We were the only ones not walking by. "Why is he dead, Yuri? Did a jackboot shoot him?" Yuri shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe no food. Could be the cold. Or maybe typhus. Take your pick." "What's typhus?" "It's a sickness. Very popular right now." "Is he an unlucky orphan?" "Yeah." He pulled me along, and from then on, I saw dead people under newspapers every day. It was easy to tell who the children were, because only one page was needed to cover them. And one day I asked Yuri, "Well, why are they covered with newspaper?" "So nobody has to see them." "Yeah, but I can see them." Yuri didn't answer. And then I saw one of them become seen by a man. He stopped in front of one, and he put his foot on top of the humped newspaper to tie his shoe. Side note, Jerry Spinelli put that in there to show how common death was at this point in the Warsaw Ghetto. The same bodies were never there 2 days in a row, but there were always new bodies in new places, and sometimes the feet were sticking out from the newspaper. In the first days, the feet always had shoes on them, and then they stopped having shoes, and then the socks were gone. And in the nights I wondered who put the newspapers over the bodies, and who took the bodies away. I thought, angels. Chapter 19. The boys and I, well, we slept in the rubble. We did not have blankets, but we did have a round braided rug, and we all slept together under the rug. But that wasn't our main blanket. Our main blanket was ourselves. We slept with our arms around each other, our noses pressed into each other's necks. Enos called it trading lice. If anybody farted, he was kicked outside the rug. And when Yuri was with us, I slept next to him. Many nights he wasn't there, and I wondered where he was. But he said, "Don't ask." So I did not ask. We were huddled kittens, the bunch of us. We were voices in the dark, and often we talked about mothers. And though I could not remember mine, I had a pretty good idea what a mother was. Not Faraday, though. He was always saying, "I don't believe in them." "Where do you think you came from?" said Enos one night under the rug. "An elephant?" "Who do you think are all those ladies holding children's hands?" said Oleg. "They're all fakes," said Faraday, whose answers were never long. He blew more smoke than words. "Everybody has a mother," said Kuba. "Everybody." Orphans, said Faraday. Whenever he spoke, you could smell his cigar breath. Orphans had mothers too, dummy. They're just dead, that's all. Real mothers don't die, said Faraday. No one had an answer to that, so we talked about oranges. Like mothers, oranges were a common topic. Enos said he had eaten them many times, but Faraday said, oranges? They were just made up. What do oranges taste like? I asked Enos, and he closed his eyes. Ugh, like nothing else. What do they look like? They look like a little sun just before it sets. Faraday said, oranges don't exist. In the morning light, most of us would begin to believe in mothers and oranges again. But for now, under the rug, in the pitch blackness, hearing the faint sounds of the city from the other side of the wall, Faraday had given us doubts about mothers and oranges. Each morning we crawled up out of the rubble and onto the streets, and sometimes we stayed together, but mostly we went our own ways. In a group, we were more of a target for the flops, who were the ghetto police. We had no armbands, we had no identification papers, we had no records, we had nothing. We don't exist, said Faraday under the rug one night. And Eno's voice came, well, could you tell that to my stomach? Enos wasn't the only one. All of us were hungry now. This was something new, hunger. Until now, we had simply stolen what we needed to eat. All of Warsaw had been our food market. Even in the ghetto at first, there was food for the taking, for quick hands and feet. But now, after months of winter, we were finding our hands and our stomachs empty. Ladies no longer walked down the street with loaves in paper bags. Bakers no longer baked as there was no flour. There were shops here and there, but the shelves were mostly empty. And where there was a morsel of food on a shelf, there was somebody standing in front of it, often with a club in his hand. Yuri came with food, sometimes. He'd bring a jar of molasses, a turnip. When he brought chewing gum, we would chew the sugar out of it and then swallow it whole. Yuri said, they are starving us. Why? I asked. They're doing it to get rid of us, to kill us, said Enos. Well, why don't they just shoot us? Enos snickered. Because they want to save money on the bullets. In the beginning, there were horses in the ghetto, but then the horses too began to disappear. Sometimes parts of them reappeared on Gizia Street. Gizia Street became an outdoor market. It was known that if you had food to sell, that was where you went. Gizia Street. People stood on the sidewalk in the snow. Resting on an upturned crate or a school desk would be the shank of a horse, or the side of a dog, or a cat, a box of salt, a licorice stick, an onion, a potato, or two, whatever they had to sell. The vendors hugged themselves against the cold and cried out, Fat here, nice goose fat, 20 zlotys. Side note, zlotys are Polish money. I have bones over here, bones, crack the bones, lots of bone marrow inside. I have pigeon for sale, pigeon. I have squirrel over here, squirrel for sale. I have dog meat, the best offer. And at first the animals appeared in the market in their feathers, or in their fur, as naturally dead as the foxes that some of the ladies still wore about their shoulders. Then, if they had fuel for fire, the vendors began to skin and pluck and roast the animals. The carcasses are dead bodies, the carcasses were laid out blackened and crusty, minus their heads, and the vendors' cries went out. And because they were cooked, the price went up. One day I walked along Gizia Street with Enos, and the smells of the roasted animals made my mouth water. I hadn't eaten since the day before, and men with clubs stood by the displays of food, and flops, the Jewish police, walked the streets. Enos himself seemed not hungry but playful, and he wiggled down the street and fluttered his fingers and made his voice high and fancy like a fox fur lady and said, "Oh, yes, that's lovely. I'll have that entire goose, please," pointing at a bird no bigger than a sparrow. "And that fine squirrel. I'll have a half pound of that, please. And that nostril of horse over there." I was laughing at Enos, and the men with the clubs were swatting at us, telling us to move on. They knew what we were up to. And then I looked at Enos's face, and suddenly I knew he wasn't playing around after all. He winked at me, and I grabbed two sparrow-sized birds from under a falling club, and the both of us ran till we couldn't hear the screams behind us. And in time there were no more birds and dogs along the Gizia Street Market. But the vendors, they never seemed to run out of squirrel. Where are all these squirrels coming from? And soon, everybody knew why. The burnt, headless, tailless bodies laid out on the crates, they weren't squirrels at all. They were rats. But the cry of the vendors never changed. "Squirrel meat, cooked squirrel over here." And one day, on my own, I snatched 2 roasted rats. I ate one myself and took the other one to Janina's house. I kept the rat in my pocket so nobody would take it from me. Only Janina and Uncle Shepsel were home. Mr. Milgram was off at the work camp, and as usual, Mrs. Milgram was at her job at the jackboot uniform factory. I took the rat from my pocket and I held it out by one leg for them to see. "I brought you a squirrel," I said. Uncle Shepsel laughed. Not only do you smell, but you're stupid," he said between laughs. "That," he flicked at it and swung from its leg between my fingers, "that is a rat." Janina took it from me and she made a face at Uncle Shepsel. "It's a squirrel," she said. "I'm going to save it for Mama and Tata." Uncle Shepsel coughed. He looked around for somewhere to spit, and then spit right on the floor. Janina punched his arm. "Tata said don't do that. You spit out the window, Uncle Shepsel." Uncle Shepsel said, "Your mother and father will know a rat when they see one. They won't eat that." Janina stomped her foot. "It's a squirrel, and they will because they're hungry." "So am I," said Uncle Shepsel, and snatched the rat from her hand. Janina grabbed for it, and now they both had it. Janina pulling on the tiny front legs, Uncle Shepsel pulling on the back legs, and they grunted and scowled at each other, and the rat came apart in the middle. Janina staggered backward onto her rear end, and by the time she got up, Uncle Shepsel was munching on his half. She tried to reach for it, but he was too tall. He kept swatting her away with his free hand as he finished off his meal. I was there when Janina's mother came back from her job. I saw the delight on her face when Janina said, "Mama, food!" And I saw the look change when she saw what it was. When Mr. Milgram came in, he looked at the little half carcass of the rat and shook his head. "No, not yet." Side note, by not yet he means they're not that desperate yet. He went to the mattress and he laid down with Mrs. Milgram. Janina started to cry. She threw the rat on the floor and kicked it at Uncle Shepsel. Uncle Shepsel picked it up, and I left then as he was brushing dirt from the rat, preparing to eat it. The next day I began walking along the wall, and until then I had not thought much about the other side. Now I thought, there's food over there. There's more than rats. The gates in the wall were guarded by jackboots and by Flops, the Jewish police. The wall was much too high to climb over, and even if I could get to the top, there was the thicket of barbed wire and broken glass, and all that day I walked and looked, I walked and looked, I walked and looked, and at last I saw something. It was not far from the uniform factory. There was a little break in the wall. It was low enough for me to reach. The hole was about 2 bricks wide. I didn't know it then, but this was a drain hole of some sort. It would never occur to them that anyone could squeeze through a space that small. I left then and came back after dark, and I was through the hole in a second, and I stood on the other side, outside of the ghetto wall. And that's the end of chapter 19.